On November the 1st, 1666, a farm labourer called Abraham Morton drew his last breath, the final victim of bubonic plague in the small village of Eyam in Derbyshire, England. His unfortunate death may not seem that remarkable, given the prevalence of the disease during this time. However, what is remarkable is that the entire village made the unprecedented decision to quarantine itself off from neighbouring villages in a valiant attempt to prevent the spread of the Great Plague. Bubonic plague is a bacterium called Yersinia pestis and is spread by infected fleas that feed on small animals, such as rats, rabbits, and cats. Once a person is bitten by an infected flea, the disease will incubate for a period of up to 7 days, at which point the victim's lymph nodes will swell and often appear black. Symptoms include fever, headaches, and vomiting. Death would typically occur within 10 days. The disease is now relatively rare throughout the world and can be treated with antibiotics if caught within 24 hours of the first sign of symptoms. Plague first appeared in Europe during the 6th century AD and continued to ravage the continent over the next 200 years. The disease was also responsible for the Black Death, which killed upwards of between 75 and 200 million people throughout Europe, Asia, and North Africa in the middle of the 14th century. By 1665, however, the disease was endemic in London and other major European cities, with the disease erupting into frequent outbreaks. Its cause was unknown at the time. Many believed it was caused by bad air or weather. Some even saw it as a punishment from God for sins committed in everyday life. At the time, London was a city of just under 500,000 inhabitants, surrounded by a city wall originally built to keep out invaders. In the poorer parts of the city, there was huge overcrowding, sanitation was non-existent, and open drains would flow through the streets. People would simply throw their garbage and sewage out of their houses into the street, which attracted hordes of flies in the summer. Workers would remove this filth as best they could and pile it up outside the city walls. The stench, however, was overwhelming. Due to these frequent outbreaks, the city would quarantine incoming vessels, with naval ships assigned to intercept anyone that tried to enter through the Thames estuary. Ships from infected ports were required to quarantine at Canvey Island for a period of 30 days before they could venture upriver. Incoming traffic from ports not yet affected by the disease would be given a certificate of health and allowed to continue up the river toward the city. The first areas to be struck were near the docks just outside London and in the parish of St. Giles, both areas rife with overcrowded living conditions. If a case was suspected, city officials would order the victim's house to be boarded up until such time as the victim either recovered or died. The famous poet Samuel Pepys lived in London during this time, and his diary provided a contemporary account of the goings-on. On April 30th he wrote, "Great fears of the sickness here in the city. It is being said that 2 or 3 houses are already shut up. God preserve us all." By July, the plague was running wild, and people were desperate to escape, including King Charles II, his family, and several court members. Most city officials and the Lord Mayor, however, decided to stay. The poor also tried to leave by the thousands, but could not exit the city gates without a signed certificate of health from the Lord Mayor. Plague doctors, often without any formal medical training or expertise, would roam the streets in an attempt to treat victims. People were so afraid they would be infected by corpses, they arranged to have bodies hastily dumped in large mass graves. By late August, the plague had arrived in Eyam. A parcel of cloth was delivered to the village tailor. When his assistant spread the cloth out by the fire to dry, he noticed it was infested with fleas. Within a few days, he was dead. The plan to quarantine the village and prevent the spread to nearby cities was the idea of the village reverend, William Mompesson, and his predecessor, Thomas Stanley. Stanley had been removed from office the previous year for refusing to swear an oath to the Church of England, and was living in exile on the outskirts of the village. Together, they came up with a three-point plan. Most importantly, they set up a quarantine cordon around the outskirts of the village, through which no resident was allowed to pass. Signs were erected to warn travelers not to enter. The village was also reliant upon supplies from neighboring villages. Any incoming food and essential goods were left outside the boundary. Villagers made payment by leaving money in water troughs filled with vinegar, which they realized helped to kill the disease. Victims were buried quickly, and as close as possible to where they died rather than in the cemetery. Just like the Londoners, there was a fear of the ravenous fleas jumping from the dead over to the living. While their actions saved the lives of people in the surrounding villages and cities, the villages themselves suffered a higher percentage of deaths than London. Out of approximately 350 to 800 inhabitants prior to the outbreak, over 260 people in Eyam perished over the 14 months of isolation. Although the death toll was high, significant medical knowledge was gained. Doctors learned that enforcing a quarantine zone could reduce or prevent the spread of disease, and such measures are used in England today to prevent the transmission of diseases such as foot and mouth. Other preventative measures attempted by the villagers, such as leaving coins in vinegar, prevented them from being handled directly by other people. This led to ideas such as sterilizing medical instruments, equipment, and clothing. In the end, this pandemic was the last time the bubonic plague would appear in England.